Hey guys, welcome back. We're going to be doing a different video today. We're going to be looking at how to build a tournament lineup for the Crucible format. Now, Faeria operates on a Crucible format for most of its competitive events. Sometimes things get shifted up within community events, but mainly if you want to enter the opens, you need to play in Crucible. Some of the other tournament formats in the community probably run this format as well. So it's good to know how you're going to build your lineup. Now, the Crucible format has rules that you must follow in order to build your lineup successfully. So let's take a look at these rules, and then we'll talk about some ideas that I have for you guys to build your lineups around. So first things first, each player submits 4 decks. So you can play up to 4 decks during a tournament game. One will be banned, we know that for sure. So one deck won't be played, but that doesn't mean you won't play that deck later on, because if it doesn't get banned in another match, you may see that deck if you lose more, or you might pick that deck first, or whatever. You can potentially play 4 decks during the tournament, so keep that in mind when you're building your lineup. Each deck cannot share more than 12 cards with any other deck in the lineup. So what this means is basically you can build multiple decks of the same color, but you are restricted by those 12 cards. So you can have the same 12 cards across all the blue decks, but the other cards will have to be different. So for example, if you build Mono Blue Jump, you could still use 12 cards from the Mono Blue Jump in your Dream Reaver deck. They're going to be quite different, but you'll still have that core amount of cards. And that's why I'm going to call it like a core set of cards that you can spread across your lineup. Opponent decks appear before the match starts. You get to see what the decks look like. Each deck displays its average Faeria cost, so you and your opponent will know how much those Faeria costs of your decks will be. This can give you an idea of what type of deck it is. Lower the Faeria cost, the more aggressive it will be. The higher the Faeria cost, the more control it will be. Each deck displays the amount of cards in each color, so you can get an idea of what the color distribution of each deck is. You'll see the little land counter with a number next to it, and this will give you an idea of what colors are in that deck. So you can see dual color decks, tricolor decks, neutrals, how many neutrals the decks are running. So if you see a mono red deck with lots of red cards, and then you see one with 9 neutrals, and you see another mono red with 3 neutrals, you can probably safely assume that the one with 3 neutrals are going to be Horse Masters, and that's going to be a mid-range deck, and the other deck might be a rush deck. So as you gain more experience in the tournament environment, as you gain more experience in Faeria, you can look at these land counters, and then you can figure out what decks they could be, and that can affect how you ban. So players choose one of their opponent's decks to ban. So using that information you have available, you can make a calculated ban based on what deck you don't want to play against with your lineup. Players choose a deck to begin. If it wins, players must continue using it until it loses. So this is like last deck standing format, you could say. This is actually quite important, the bottom bit, because that could dictate how you build your lineup. I do have a lineup based around this rule, but we'll go into that a little bit later. So that's basically the rules of the Crucible format, and you will be building lineups based on that. So where do we start then? What type of lineups could you build? So I have a lineup which I've decided to call the comfort lineup. Now, the reason I've called it the comfort lineup is because I feel that this is a lineup that is great for players who are comfortable with a couple of decks and just use the decks they're good at. So the whole idea is you play decks you have the most experience with, use your experience with the decks to win games rather than playing mind games, analyzing metas, or kind of go into that kind of next step when it comes to building lineups. Decks may not be as strong as meta decks, depending on what you play on the ladder, but the key is you will have a lot of experience with these decks, and that is going to be the strength of the lineup in general. And this is also very good for players who are trying to build tournament experience, or even just gameplay experience. So you've been on a ladder, you've played a couple of archetypes, and then you decide, and then you just take those archetypes and build different versions of them in your lineup. Let's get into an example. So I'm going to build a comfort lineup. I'm going to build my own comfort lineup. So I'm going to build decks that I'm comfortable with, and I'll give you an example of a lineup that I would run if I was using this type of lineup building. Alright guys, we're going to take a look at my comfort lineup. So if I was going to pick two archetypes to take a look at, it would be blue control and green red. These are two of my favorite colors and color combination. As you guys know, I know how much I enjoy playing something like Chaos Control or green red Yakapult. So I've decided that they're going to be the two decks I'm focusing on because they are two of the types of decks that I've had the most experience with. And I generally do well with these decks if I do play them on ladder. So if I'm looking to climb, I generally go to blue or I go to green-red. Now, to help manage the 12 card limit, I've made two separate decks with the 12 cards that I'm going to be using across these decks. And the main reason is it's just a good way to keep track of what your decks are using, that they can share, and then the cards you have to change. You do have to make compromise with this strategy. I think that's one of its weaknesses. You have to compromise because obviously you don't get to use all of the good cards across the both decks. But I feel there are enough cards in the Faeria card pool to allow you to be quite flexible. Now, let's take a look. So we have blue 12. My 12 cards for blue. I've got Emperor's Command, Imperial, Airship Radiance for the heals. Forbidden Library. Can't be a Dreamweaver deck without Forbidden Library. Water Elementals. I need the ramp. I need to make sure I can get those lakes down fast. Aurora, because she's just so good. She's going to really help me leverage the board. And then I have one Dreamweaver in here. So I'm just making sure that both my decks can have a minimum of one Dreamweaver. I'm not sure if I actually need this. I probably don't because I'm only using 3 Dreamweavers across the two decks now that I think about it. So this could actually be a bit more flexible. Maybe this becomes Humbling Visions. Maybe this becomes the other Radiance if I decide to run the other Radiance in the Chaos Control. Because I am only using 3 Dreamweavers across the 3 decks. So actually, yeah, let's do that then. I was looking for a slot for my last Chaos Control, so yeah, let's stick Radiance in it. So we're going to stick Radiance here, so both Radiances, so I have access to both of them across the 2 decks. So they are the 12 cards that can feature in my decks, in my 2 decks. There are 3 Dreamweavers I have access to. I've split them 2-1. The Dreamweaver deck taking priority of the 2, just because I wanted to be more consistent. So yeah, that's what we're going to do here. So let's take a look at Chaos Control, and I can make a quick change to this. Now, this is my classic Chaos Control from the start of the Resurgence expansion. I've made some changes based on how I'm going to distribute the cards across my 2 decks. So the major changes I have made so far for this is only one, actually. I've taken out Frogify because I've decided that Humbling Visions is going to be a better removal option for Chaos Control because of its synergies with the towers and Emperor Chaos and all that stuff. And then I've given my Dreamweaver deck Frogify. So I've split my removal options between them. I've done this for my green-red as well. So this is, yeah, pretty standard Chaos Control. I took out the Frogify from the build that was featured in Become a God earlier on in the Resurgence expansion, and all I've done is replaced it with this Radiant Scourge of Oversky because this card is very, very good, and it can offer blue control a lot because blue control is very good against a lot of Faeria. So pretty standard Chaos Control you guys have probably seen before. Fagoro could have actually been a better option than the Radiance. I could have actually added Fagoro to my 12 and then dropped Radiance to make sure that actually might just be better, but just for the sake of the tutorial, let's just say I decided to go with Radiance. So that's my Chaos deck. That's my first blue deck. For my second blue deck, I've gone for Dreamweaver. So we're running both Radiances, Emperor's Command, Forbidden Library, Water Elementals, Aurora. Then we've got 2 Dreamweavers in here. So my one deck had 1 Dreamweaver. This one has 2. So maxed out on Dreamweavers now. For this build, because I don't have access to Battletoads, I've decided to go down an enchant route instead, using the Sturdy Shells. I've also decided to go for Archons to help with the 7s. So we have Archons and we have Commanders. This is a bit flexible. I wasn't sure what to put here, but I figured Commanders would help me in the early game and help me collect. So this, instead of going for Battletoads, so Battletoads could have been a card in my 12, but I decided that the Emperor's Command, the Water Elementals, and the Libraries were more important. I've gone for a Gabrian package with Enchant, because Enchant synergizes with Reaver anyway, and this may not be the optimal Dream Reaver deck I'd want to run, but some of my opponents will probably be making the same sacrifices depending on how they build their lineup. And I'm confident enough with blue control that I feel I could make this work. Maybe I could have done a bit more testing beforehand, before I built this deck, so maybe I want to test this first and then refine it, but keeping those 12 cards in mind. So these are my first two decks. So I am guaranteed to play a blue control deck, which I feel is one of my stronger decks, and, you know, playing towards the comfort and playing towards my experience. Now, for my second style of deck, I've chosen green-red. I've played a lot of green-red. I'm a big fan of the archetype, and I've built two different styles of decks, one that uses Yakapult and one that uses Crackthorn. So while the Yakapult one is more of a control style, the Crackthorn one is more of a mid-range style, which is fine, I can play mid-range, and more inspired by the recent Crackthorn decks that have been doing well in the last few opens by Sunkichi and Raizo. So for this, I decided that I wanted Rako and Revel in every deck, and Emerald Salamander, like, these two were key. These are great cards, they have fantastic synergies, and I can use these as turn 1 collectors in both decks. Decided Ground Shaker is super important as well. It's one of the more meatier cards in the deck, doing that little bit of chip damage, also having a really good body, like a 5/6 down, so I decided that was very important. Garadan, global AoE, can't turn it down. I need it in both decks. Going to make sure I can manage the board and be able to counter swarm decks if they show up. Tiki Caretaker was my last choice. Now, I was considering Runin's Guidance, but Tiki Caretaker has fantastic synergy with Salamander, and I decided that this was the better of all the other cards I could have chosen that has the synergy with Salamander. Whereas the other cards I could have decided on, like Underground Brigand, maybe Axe Grinder, I can switch them out. I can be flexible with those slots. So that's my 12 for green-red. Let's take a look at my Yak deck. So for the Yakapult style deck, I've gone more control, and then for the Crackthorn, I've gone more mid-range. Now, this deck runs guidances for the heals, so I have more sustain, because I'll be fighting at my own orb more, whereas the mid-range deck will be pushing down one side. I have the Yakapults, my win condition. We have the Revelers in here. I put Tephra in this build, because I feel that Majinata might be better in the Crackthorn variant because of its mobility. This deck runs Cypher's Wrath because it's a little cheaper, and Faeria might be more difficult to manage if I only have control of one well, if my opponent plays very aggressive. I put Rako and Copter in here, more removal. And yeah, and I put one grappling hook just in case I want to shoot across. And then I've used my one of the Tiki Caretakers, because I have two I can use across two decks. So I've used my last Tiki Caretaker in this build, just because it's a more controlling style deck. And that's why Leia's been in here as well, just because, you know, control. That's the theme here. So for my Crackthorn deck, I decided that I'd build it more around the Sunkichi style build, and I've made some replacements. So instead of running the two Guidance and the one Tiki Caretaker, I have my two Tiki Caretakers that I can spread across both decks, and I've put Elderwood Embrace instead. A bit bulkier, you know, make my guys a bit more threatening. Instead of Leia, I put Shozen in as a good mobile mid-range threat. Majinata replaces Tephra. Now, Tephra could have went in my 12. I was considering it, but because Majinata existed, I figured that I could free up a slot, and that's where the Tiki Caretakers took that place. So instead of Rako and Copters and stuff like that, I've gone for Brigands and Axe Grinders. Again, really solid mid-range creatures. This deck takes Cypher, play more mid-range. Cypher's great at that. And then I have Crackthorn instead of the Yakapult. So Crackthorn and Cypher replace the Yakapults as my win conditions. And yeah, this plays more mid-range style, but I can switch to control, I can switch to aggression. That's the flexibility of the mid-range archetype. So that would be my comfort lineup. You know, I've picked two styles of decks I like, the green-red and the blue control, and I've made 4 decks for the lineup. So I'm guaranteed to play an archetype that I'm comfortable with. And I think this is a really good way for you guys to play if you only focus on a couple of decks and then just make variations of those decks. It's very easy to do with Yellow Rush, very easy to do with Red Rush. Very easy to do with mono green. You can build like a slower mono green, like a Beastmaster version, and then build a more mid-range version using Verdant Forces, whereas like the Beastmaster version uses like Farian Golems, Oaklands, and Grove Guardians, so that you can build different types. You may even want to splash another color, maybe make a green-yellow mid-range if you're comfortable with it. But yeah, this is my comfort lineup. This is how you would build it. Take 2 archetypes, build 2 different decks for each archetype with minor changes. Just when you choose your 12, just think about what that archetype needs instead of what it wants. So if the archetype needs, so blue controlled needs library, it needs water elementals, it needs Emperor's Command for the library. Emperor's Command could be Healing Song, but I don't want to do that. So when you do build this lineup, do your 12 first, think about what both decks will need, and then build 2 decks around it. So yeah, that's the comfort lineup. Let's move on to a different style of lineup. Before we move on to the next lineup, just some final thoughts on the comfort style lineup. I think its major weakness is you do have to be quite comfortable with deck building. It's a little easier if you choose archetypes that already are quite popular, because then you can just do a bit of research and then try and build a few different variations of it. But I do think it does demand some comfort with deck building. But I also feel that it's a great way to become a good deck builder, because you force yourself to build your own decks. Bit of trial and error. That experience will pay off in the long run. So if you do want to become a deck builder, the comfort lineup is a great way to flex your deck building muscle, train that muscle up and become big and strong, and then you're able to build some good decks and refine your deck building for the future, and it will definitely pay off later on. But if you feel that you're not much of a deck builder or not very comfortable with deck building, you can try the meta lineup. Now, this lineup takes all the decks that players have been making throughout an expansion, and then you just choose the best ones. So you just look at decks that have already been tried and tested by other players or by other competitors in tournament environments. You take a look at the hub, you take a look at the deck sharing on the Discord, figure out which decks are the best from your experience on ladder and what people are saying, and then just build a lineup of the best decks and then pilot them to success. So this lineup style is really good for pilots, players who feel like they're good at playing the game, or just feel that if they're given a good deck they can perform and do pretty well and don't have to rely on their own deck building in order to build a lineup. So I'm going to show you an example of this. This is a lineup for the Resurgence meta. So if you are watching this video and we're a few expansions down the line, the lineup won't be so relevant, but I will just give you a few thoughts on why I chose these decks for this time, and yeah, let's take a look at them. Alright, we'll take a look at my meta lineup. So I've taken decks that I believe are very strong in this meta, but also generally a lot of the competitive community believe these are some of the best decks in the game right now. These have also been tried and tested by players in the competitive scene in other tournaments. So for example, this blue-green deck, Blue-Green Beast, has been a very strong deck for a while now. This is Rhizo's build. So I just went on the hub, I took a look at the lineups for the recent Kaleem's Open, and Essador had a Beast build and Rhizo had a Beast build, but I decided to go for the more aggressive variant, which was ran by Rhizo, and this is just a copy of it. So I'm looking to pilot Rhizo's deck building to success in the tournament if I was to play this lineup. And this is just kind of your traditional blue-green beasts, just a bit faster, that's all. It has Sunken Tower, it has water elementals to accelerate the lands, so it's looking to play quite aggressive once it gets down one side. Another deck that's been performing very well in tournament and on ladder is Blue Jump. This is my version of Blue Jump. I decided that I wanted to run Ninja Toads in mine. I put Beirut in there as well for a bit of late game beef. Say I go against mono green or something. Beirut's are pretty tough to deal with. Green-red also can struggle a lot with Beirut, so anything that doesn't have transform, hard removal, or a good swallow ability will have problems with it. And it's just your kind of typical tempo-orientated blue jump build, using commanders for the game pressure and collection. You have your Archons and your Triton Warriors, solid 4 cost mobile creatures. This gets a bit better later on if the game goes late and I get to drop some Colossus down, or I get to play a Phantasm. So just a typical blue jump deck. So Yellow Flyers is a deck that's definitely been picking up in popularity recently. I've seen it a lot on ladder. Not so much in tournament, but I feel this deck has tremendous potential and could be the new deck that the yellow players want to play. The Bloat Fly was a great buff to Flyers. It just creates this kind of form of inevitability. If you can't answer the Corrupt, the Bloat Fly just keeps making more guys, creating more value, making it more difficult to win a game. And it also has all the good stuff from yellow, right? Like the Drake Rider, the Flash Winds, the mobility, the flying creatures, the Manta Riders, the champions. So yeah, I feel that the Yellow Flyers is just really good in this current meta, and that's why I picked it for this lineup. Now for the last deck, it's a Beastmaster deck. Now, green Beastmaster is not the best ladder deck, but it does very well in tournament. Mainly because it's a deck that can grind out games. It's very good on the defense. It can outvalue your opponent if it's very once it gets going, and it can be a good counter pick to some matchups. And this deck has performed very well for players like Alvar, and it does crop up a lot in top level Faeria play. So I decided, well, actually, I would like this available just in case I need it. So I decided that Beastmaster Green was a good last pick. It could have been other stuff. I could have maybe played Red Yellow Burn, maybe Mono Red Aggro, or Yellow Rush, Red Mid-Range, Green Red is a deck I could have ran. This lineup was quite similar to Riser. Riser ran Blue Jump Yellow Flyers, but these are different versions of them, which I've worked on. And then this is the last slot, he had Green Red Crackthorn. I decided Beastmaster Green might be a bit better. But this is just a meta lineup. Did my research, looked at the hub, looked on the Discord, seen what people are saying, what people are playing, and then craft a lineup around it. So this is a really good lineup for a pilot. Maybe you feel like you have enough card game experience that it can, you know, drive your lineup rather than having to build decks of your own and build your own kind of lineup around your favorite archetypes. You can just pick up a deck and play it very easily. It's a good way to get experience with the top decks, because if you play the top decks, you'll know how to beat them. So the meta lineup is also very good for that. And if you're not comfortable with deck building, this gives you a way to just, you know, net deck, which is fine. You know, if you're playing a tournament, use all the resources you have, and then you can play a solid lineup with tried and tested decks. But yeah, that sums up the meta lineup. Let's move on to some more theory-based lineups. So our next lineup is the anti-meta lineup. So this is a high-risk, high-reward lineup that counters the meta directly. It takes a lot of research, matchup practice, and predictions to pull off. So you need to know your stuff to do an anti-meta lineup, because you're kind of rolling the dice here. You're just hoping that everyone plays certain decks, and then your counter decks will have the tools in order to win those games. So your decks are just really teched for certain matchups. And the biggest issue with this lineup is if you don't guess right, these tech choices could come back to bite you and don't perform very well against other matchups. Or your decks are just so teched out that they just lose to everything else. And that has been a case in the past. Now, I did say currently Faeria is in a place where the meta is quite diverse, and you can kind of play there's a wide array of decks that you can choose from if you want to build a lineup. But if the meta was a bit more predictable, like if let's say Yellow Rush was god tier, it's the best deck in the game, arguably. Like, you can't even argue against it. It's just that good, and everyone's playing Yellow Rush because Yellow Rush is so good. It's the best way to climb. It's the best way to win tournaments. Then you could build an anti-meta lineup in anticipation of Yellow Rush being at least 2 picks in a Crucible lineup. And then let's say Red Rush is also very good. So the top deck is Yellow Rush, and just below it, say Tier 1. So Tier S is Yellow Rush, Tier 1 is Red Rush. You build anti-red decks. Now, it's difficult for me to give an example of this lineup because I'd have to create a scenario where certain decks are the best in the game and then build the decks to counter it. But this is a lineup from when you're more experienced in building Crucible lineups, but also when the meta is a little unbalanced, to say the least. But it's a viable option. Players have done it in the past, but like I said, high risk, high reward can work out if your predictions are right and everyone's playing these decks and your anti-meta decks do pan out, or it could go horribly wrong and your decks just don't match up against all the other decks that are being played in the meta. Now for our last type of lineup, we have the counter pick lineup. Now this is more built around the last deck standing part of the rules. Basically, in last deck standing, if your first deck wins, you have an advantage in a counter pick lineup because your opponent will then pick their best matchup into your deck, in theory, because they want to get a win. And then they beat your deck, and then you pick the counter to that deck, and then so on. And you go back and forth picking counters and counters and counters, but as long as you get the first win, you are ahead because your counter picks will line up better against their counter picks. Now this, again, is more of a meta call. The meta needs to be very fixed. There needs to be kind of set expectations of what the players are bringing. So one way you would do this, you choose your archetype, which is your best deck. Let's say you're Alvar and you're a green master. So you decide that actually you're going to build 2 green decks because green is one of the best decks in the game, in theory. In this magical scenario that I'm creating. So green is one of the best decks in the game. You build 2 green decks because you don't want a green deck to get banned. And if you're Alvar, everyone knows you love green, they're going to ban one of them. And then your next 2 decks are counter picks to what your opponents might counter your green. So let's say green, mono green control is really bad against blue jump. Blue jump has Frogify, it has lots of tempo. It's very difficult for green to get board control back. So you play green in your first game, you win, you're a happy person. Your opponent counter picks with blue jump. So then you decide, right, I have an anti-blue jump deck. So for example, I think my red-yellow events, which I recently showed in an episode, is very good against blue jump. So I bring red-yellow events because it has a good matchup against blue jump. Then my opponent might pick, say, I don't know, a mono green, which is good against red-yellow events because I don't have a lot of hard removal. I have a lot of chip damage removal, so they bring mono green. And then I bring blue jump to counter the mono green. Or I just play another anti-counter deck. So say mono green's worst matchups are blue jump and yellow flyers. I bring an anti-blue jump deck and an anti-yellow flyers deck. So 2 green decks and an anti-deck for those. So the counter pick lineup is a bit more theory than practice. I haven't really seen anyone do this yet. All that I'm aware of. So if you are a tournament player and you have tried this before, let me know. But the main idea is you pick you build 2 decks of the one archetype that is one of the strongest in the game, or that you're just amazing at, and then your other 2 decks are decks to support that archetype and counterpick it, and counterpick against decks that beat your main deck. So you're basically building a lineup around one archetype, with your last 2 decks being the bodyguards, the protective decks to stop those counter picks from taking you out. So let's build a counter pick lineup. I think I can do this one. The anti-meta is like really high theory. This one is a bit more viable. So let's build a counter pick lineup. All right, so this is an example of a counter pick lineup. As my main deck, I've chosen Yellow Rush. So looking at 12 yellow, we're making sure we have the essential parts of Yellow Rush, the Kaleem's Prayer, the Soul Drains, the Wind Soldiers, and the Zealous Crusaders. We have the removal, the economy, and the finisher. So we have 2 different types of Yellow Rush. We have the Sagittarius build, which is 2.7. Let me just check this one, and this one is 2.8. So we would make sure that the cover of our decks are these, just so our opponent doesn't know which one's which. that would be the key. Deck covers is something I'll talk about in a little bit, but so we have the Sagittarius Yellow Rush, which is the stronger of the two. This is pretty much the bee's knees Yellow Rush build at the moment, using the fish, the salmons as the aggressive cards. You just Sagittarius to generate economy. We have cheap, powerful creatures to push damage, and then we have our finisher, the Zealous Crusader. And I packed in a couple of Choking Sands and Last Nightmares to help us navigate around the board and make sure these salmons can go face. And then for the second Yellow Rush build, we have a bit more of an old school traditional style. Following my video I did earlier, I built a different version. So this is a little different, using the monks, using the followers, air elementals to get lands down, gives us access to Manta Riders, Demon Wranglers to be used on followers, monks, and the mantas that come out of the Manta Rider. So more of an old school version of Yellow Rush. So now my last two decks are decks to help against specific matchups. Now mono green, like I said, is quite popular in tournament, and all the taunts can be a big problem, especially for this version of Yellow Rush. The Living Willow is a nightmare. So a good deck to beat mono green is Blue Jump. A little different to the one from the previous lineup, I decided to add an extra Frogify for the matchup. Just because if we're trying to counter a specific deck, we might as well play more cards that help us counter that. But pretty much very similar to the other Blue Jump build that was in the meta lineup. And then I figured that Yellow Flyers could be a problem, just because of all the value they generate, and they have lots of removal. So it could be a problem. So I decided to pack Red Control to try and combat the Yellow Flyers. Yellow Flyers can be taken out by lots of removal. So we're actually running Firestorm in this to help us take away the bloat flies and stuff. We have a few good finishes in here. We have Baldarian, Cypher, and Chosen. And then we just have lots of removal and value. So lots of Faeria generation, recycling the Power Wheel. And then we have Havocs, Ground Shakers, Flamebirds, Cypher's Wrath, all the good stuff that Red wants. Didn't put Bomb Slinger in this because it's vulnerable to Spirit Theft, which is ran in Yellow Flyers. And if this is a counter to Yellow Flyers, I'm not saying it is directly, just an idea of what of a deck that could counter Yellow Flyers. Red Control might be able to do it. So yeah, basically we are building a bit like, it's a little bit like the Comfort lineup, but instead we're just building two decks and then we're relying on counter picks to win the game. But that's just an example of how you would want to build a counter pick lineup. This is more of a theory. I don't know if any players have tried this yet. If you're brave enough to try it, tell me how it goes. But I think this could work out, depending on how well you read the meta and how well you know your matchups and what decks counters to this. So there's a lot of mind games going on. But yeah, I feel this lineup does have a lot of potential. And that covers all the lineups I've come up with for the Crucible formats. A few tips and tricks about tournament play and building your lineups as well. The deck covers, which we just briefly talked about in the last lineup analysis. You don't want your deck covers to give too much information because your opponent can see your deck cover. So just make deck covers that are generic cards that are used in that color. So for example, for yellow, I did the Soul Drains. Pretty much all yellow decks run Soul Drain. For red, Cypher's Wrath. For blue, Battletoads potentially, or maybe the Humbling Visions now that Humbling Visions is so popular. For green, you can do Elderwood Embrace or Runin's Guidance. I wouldn't do cards like Forbidden Library or Feed the Forest. Like, you don't want to do cards like that because that gives away too much information. So choose a deck cover that features a generic card that's used across all colors just to keep your opponents guessing. You don't want to give away too much information. If you put Garadan as your deck cover, then your opponent knows Garadan's in your deck. You don't want your opponent to know that, so keep that secret if you can. Another thing to consider as well for longer tournaments that you have to use brain power, obviously, to play this game. So the more linear and more straightforward your decks are, And the more comfortable you are with them, the less energy you have to use thinking about your plays, because you can play a bit more reactive, because you have been in these situations so many times through experience or from how the deck plays is so simple, and then you can make decisions quicker without using so much energy. And that's really important in long tournaments. You don't want to get burned out before you get to the finals, because you've had to make very intricate decisions every turn for every game you've played. And that's always a rule that I've personally followed when playing in tournaments. Just keep your decks simple, or just keep them familiar, because that will pay off over a long tournament if you do get those wins and you start building up the tournament ladder. So that wraps up this video covering the Crucible format and how to build a lineup. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope it guys helps you out. If you have any thoughts, be sure to leave a comment, or any tips for players. You know, I don't actually play Crucible, I only commentate it. So this is from watching and kind of theory crafting about it myself, because I can't play in tournaments. But I'm sure these lineups are viable, especially the comfort and the meta ones. The other two are a bit more theory driven, but if you are brave enough to try it out, be sure to do it. I'm sure you'll get some interesting results, and I'd love to hear about them. So yeah, if you like this video, be sure to give a thumbs up. If you haven't already, drop a subscribe to keep up to date of when our content goes live. If you're looking for ideas of decks to play, be sure to check out some of my other videos. I do feature decks that I've built or built by other community members that have been used in tournament or in ladder play. So you can try them out and then see how you feel about it, and then maybe they will feature in your tournament lineups in the future. So until next time, guys, take care, and I hope you enjoyed my guide on the Crucible format.